Okay, first we just need to review and talk about what a function is. So a function is a rule that pairs every input with exactly one output. An example of a function could be f of x is equaling to 3x minus 5, where your inputs are going to be those x values and your outputs are going to be those f of x values. Now that we know a little about functions, let's now talk about the inverse relation, or finding inverses of relations. Okay, I want you to recall that a relation pairs inputs with outputs. So an example of that would be, for instance, maybe I have the inputs of 2, 3, 4, and 5, and they have outputs of 1, 6, 7, and 3. I could say that this is a relation because my inputs, which are my x values here, pair, okay, with outputs, which are here. All right, so now that we know what a relation is, we're going to talk about finding inverses of relations, okay? An inverse relation switches the input and output values of the original relation. What that simply means is if I take this entire relation, because we're calling this whole thing a relation, okay, this whole thing is a relation. If I take this relation and I switch my inputs, which we know are x, and I switch my outputs, which we know are y, I reverse them, and I get an inverse relation. So what that means is if I take this relation right here, and I make my y values my new x values, I would have new input values of 1, 6, 7, and 3, and the new output values, which are y, are 2, 3, 4, and 5. Notice I still have a relation here, okay, but it's the inverse of the original. Another relation is represented on the screen. This whole thing is what we call a relation, all right, where all of my inputs are my x values, which I'm going to highlight in red. So here are all my inputs. And all my outputs, which I'm going to highlight in black, are all of those y values. Now I want to find the inverse of this relation. In order to do that, I'm going to switch the coordinates of each ordered pair. So I'm going to take my 7, which was a y, and it's now going to become an x. And I'm going to take my -4, which was an x, and now make it a y. So now I have my inverse of my original relation point. Okay, and I'm going to keep doing this throughout this relation. All right, so if you look at my new relation here, you'll notice it's the inverse relation. I switched the inputs and the outputs. If you're still struggling to understand inverse relations, please make sure you come find me during class and I will go over it in more detail. If you understand how to do inverse relation, please solve problem number 1 and 2. Now that we know inverses of relations, we're going to talk about finding inverses of functions algebraically. The reason that we do this is so that we can find the inverse of a given function no matter what inputs or outputs we put in. Okay, in the previous slide we talked about finding the inverse of a relation when we're given the inputs and outputs, but here we want to find the inverse of a function so we can find all the possible answers that make the function true. So if I look at the function f of x is equal to 4x minus 9, I want to focus on finding the function inverse. In order to do that, I'm going to follow 4 simple steps. Step 1, go ahead and take f of x and change it to y. Step 2. Step 2 is to go ahead here and change x and y. Just like we did when we were finding the inverse of a relation, we flipped x and y. Our third step is going to be, we're going to go ahead and solve the equation for y. And then the final step to get our inverse function is to go ahead and take y and change it to the function inverse notation. All right, so that would then signify that this function right here is the inverse of our original function. All right, now we're going to go ahead and we're going to go back to that original function from the previous slide, and we are going to follow all 4 of our steps to find the function inverse. Alrighty, step 1 here, step 1 was to go ahead and take f of x and change it to y. So we're going to go ahead and classify that as step 1. This is now y is equal to 4x minus 9. All right, step 2 here is to then go ahead and switch y and x. So step 2 here is going to be x is equal to 4y minus 9. Alrighty, step 3 is to then solve the equation for our y variable by doing the inverse of everything. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to first add 9 to both sides. Once we add 9 to both sides, we get x plus 9 is equal to 4y. Do the inverse of multiplying, which is dividing both sides by 4. You get y is equal to x plus 9 over 4. Last but not least is to make sure that our inverse function has the proper notation here. So we're going to change this y to the function inverse. So the inverse of our original function, sorry, that should be -1 there, is equal to x plus 9 over 4. So right now, this is telling us that this is the inverse of our original function.